So, welcome to our session where I'm going to take you through the process of installing, configuring, and deploying your SAP Business One Cloud Control Center. Now, back in 2013, I actually recorded some videos showing you this process. But I guess it's fair to say that it's now 2017, 2013 to 2017, there's been quite a few changes. And of course, one of the biggest changes has been the advent of SAP HANA. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the process of using the Cloud Control Center, and we're going to mix a combination of SAP Business One running on SQL Server and SAP Business One version for HANA. And we're going to deploy all of these from the single Cloud Control Center environment. Now, important point to note, I'm not going to take you through the process of installing HANA, alright, or the process of installing Linux or Windows Server 2016 or any of those things. I'm going to assume that you have got that down pat. But of course, once these main sessions are done, if there is a need to, I can take you through some of those steps. So I'm going to assume that when I tell you that this machine needs to be running SUSE Enterprise Linux 11 Service Pack 4, you know how to get that up and running and installed. And when I tell you this machine needs to be running SQL Server 2016 or whatever, that you're familiar with doing that. Of course, if you're not, feel free to get in touch if you would like me to put together some sessions running you through some of those basics of setting up that baseline infrastructure. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with our very first machine, and it's important to understand that the process, the order in which you deploy each of these components is very important when you're utilizing the Cloud Control Center. I've learned that the hard way. And just a special shout out to Corné Bosma in the SAP Netherlands team, who, those of you who read my LinkedIn post will know, he helped me out with, with some knowledge sharing. So when I was struggling, Corné passed on some best practices to me. So I'm going to try and share those with you. But I just wanted to make sure that I acknowledge him because a lot of this stuff that I learned as a result of talking with him. So anyway, we're going to assume that you've been and you've downloaded SAP Business One Cloud Control Center, and you have downloaded version 1.1 patch level 8, which is the latest build, which is up on the Partner Edge portal. Now, you've downloaded that, so the very first thing you need to do is you need to install that. So what I've done is I have all of my servers and all of my Windows machines set up in a single domain environment, and I'm using roaming profiles. So no matter which machine I log on to, I always get access to all the files I need in my downloads folder, in my documents folder, because I'm using those roaming profiles. So what I've done is I've put all of those components in the downloads folder, and then I can access them from anywhere I need to. So I'm just going to go here into my downloads, and you'll see I've extracted out the files and I've put it into a folder called B1 Cloud Patch Level 8. Now, you can call it Rumpelstiltskin for all it matters. It really is not relevant. But what you do need to do is you do need to make sure you've got access to those files from every single one of the machines that you're going to install on, because we're going to install the Cloud Control Center, the system landscape directory for the Cloud Control Center on this machine. But then every machine that's in your cloud environment, you're going to have to install the SLD agent onto, including all of your Linux boxes. And we're going to talk about that very, very shortly. So let's get our Cloud Control Center set up. Now, you're going to need to have access to a SQL Server machine, 2012, 2014, or 2016. It really doesn't matter, as long as it's not 2008 R2, because that's no longer supported by Microsoft. So when you create your system landscape directory, it needs to persist all that information into a database. Now, you can store that database on HANA, Personally, I like to keep HANA just for the bare minimum HANA files because HANA certified hardware is at a premium. So you want to make sure that you keep that available to the max for running the core HANA component. So everything else I use, I'm going to put onto SQL Server. I'm going to use Windows Server boxes wherever I can, but there are a couple of components of the Business One on HANA that you are going to want to put on some other Linux boxes, but more about that later. So you'll see we've got our SLD underscore x64 because it is now full 64-bit environment. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose to run as administrator. Now, another important point, when you're building your environment, if you're building for a productive environment where you're going to be hosting customers, then you want to make sure that all of your hardware is certified and that you follow the guidance to the letter for how to size your environments. And there's documentation that explains all of that on the Partner Edge portal. But the other thing to bear in mind is that if possible, you should try and use fully qualified domain names for every machine that you're working with. Don't mix IP addresses and those fully qualified domain names, particularly with HANA. If you're using fully qualified domain names, stick to that. If you're using IP addresses, stick to it. Personally, as I've written before, I like to use fully qualified domain names, and they resolve to internal addresses because I have an internal DNS server. And they'll also, where necessary, resolve to external addresses through an external DNS mapping that I have set up as well. The other thing, please, 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 make sure you get yourself a wildcard SSL certificate for the domain that you are using. So in my instance, in my scenario, I use a domain smbsolutions.com.au. Now, I pay for my wildcard certificate. It gets renewed every year, but it is now possible to actually get free wildcard certificates. The only challenge with those is you have to renew them every 3 months. To me, it's worth it paying the money not to have to go through all that hassle. But very, very important. That is going to make your life so much easier if you have those fully qualified domain names. None of the rubbish with self-signed certificates and having to export files and map them through and everything like that. If you're using a wildcard certificate that you got from a certifying authority, you don't have to do anything except install it and start using it. All right, so enough of all of the preamble. Let's continue on. So I'm going to say next, and then the first question it's going to ask you is, have you followed up and have you read the information in this SAP note? Right, so I would encourage you to do that. That just goes through and explains to you what you need to be aware of as you're installing the solution. So we're going to pick our destination location, and I'm going to put it in the default location. Okay, so now a couple of things to be aware of here. The best practice is to create an additional administrator in your domain, and you might want to call it B1C admin. All right, and you just need to make sure that that user has administration rights. But from my perspective, I'm just going to go and I'm going to use my standard administrator. Okay, my standard administrator account, but you should create a new user, call it B1C admin, and use that as your user for doing your installation. And then of course you put in your password that's mapped to that user in the domain, and then you're going to pick the host name or IP address for the system landscape directory. Now by default it's going to pick up your machine name, but I've also mapped this machine name through to not only CCC1 but also just CCC, right? Because I actually have 2 Cloud Control Center machines in my environment for redundancy. So I'm just going to map it through so that it is ccc.smbsolutions.com.au, and then we'll say next. Now this is where the certificate comes into it, right? You want to choose HTTPS, and then you're going to need to browse out to where your certificate store is. where you've created your wildcard certificate. So I've got that certificate store and I've put it in my environment. So if I just navigate out. Now remember, whenever you're using these certificates and you're bringing them in, it's always a good idea to store it in a local environment, store it in a local location, right? Because sometimes if you're trying to bring in those certificates from a network share, it doesn't work, all right? So let's just go and pick up that file. And there's my file. In my case, it's just called SMB Wild. And that's a PKCS12 certificate file. So you can tell by the PFX extension. Put in your password that you created when you made up that certificate. And then say next, and it's going to validate that, make sure you didn't make a mistake. And then you can specify, all right, on this local machine, when you're setting up the Cloud Control Center user interface, which is a website, you can basically say, how do I want that configured? Do I want it as the default web application? So do I want it as root? Or do I want it in a subfolder? All right, so in this particular instance, I'm going to say I want this as root. I'm going to bind it to all the IP addresses that are assigned to this machine because there's really only one. And I am going to use the default port of port 443 for HTTPS. That way, when I want to log on to this machine, I'm just going to put https://ccc.smbsolutions.com.au and bang, it'll take me straight to it. Right? Nice and simple, nice and easy. Then it's going to ask you, all right, what database server do you want to put your data on? So in my case, I'm actually going to put it on a database called SBOSQL. I'm going to leave it in a database name called SLD Data because that's the default. And then I'm going to use database server authentication to be used when that database is being created. Now you can use Windows authentication if the user that you're doing the login as has all the necessary rights on your SQL server. But if you use the SA password, username and password, then you should be in pretty good shape. So that's what I'm going to use. It's going to go ahead and it's going to validate that. And then it's going to ask you, well, what username do you want to have that's going to access the Cloud Control Center? And this specified user must be a member of the SMB Solutions domain. So again, this is where you can use your B1C admin user. In my scenario, I'm going to use administrator. All right. So I say next. That's it. All my questions are now answered. I hit the install button and let the system run away and do its magic. So this is fairly straightforward. This is kind of the easy part, getting this this section of the application or the cloud environment up and running. And this is no different in most respects to what you might have seen me do before. All right, when I did the original recordings back in 2013. It's going to start getting different now when we start bringing in our HANA servers and we start mapping all these things out. Okay. All right, so that's now done. We're going to say finish. So our Cloud Control Center is now installed and it should be up and running and ready to go. So let's give that a try. So I'm going to go in. Let's open up Google Chrome. I always like using Google Chrome as my web browser. I find it to be the most compatible with most things, either Google Chrome or Firefox. Let's just maximize that. So remember, where am I going to find it? https://ccc.smbsolutions.com.au. And through the marvels of modern technology, there it is, your SAP Business One Cloud Control Center. Now, if by chance it doesn't start up, just go in and check your services. All right. So you can just go and run services.msc That'll open up the list of the running services for you, or of course you can go the long way through the control panel. And what you're going to find when you scroll through the list of running services, you will have your SAP Business One SLD service. And that should be the only service that's running on this machine that's got anything to do with SAP Business One. All right? And so, important thing to remember, this machine, anytime you now go and install the SLD agents, which are the components that you put on each of the different machines in your cloud environment, they're always going to point back to this machine. They're always going to register back against this system landscape directory. All right, so if you tried logging on and it didn't work, then just go in here and double check that the service is running. If the service is running and it's still not logging on, then obviously you're going to have to do some more debugging, but this usually tends to be the most trouble-free section of the process. So now if I go in here and I log on as administrator, remember for you it might be B1C admin. For me, I've decided to keep my administrator name. And remember, this password is the password that you have set up against the domain user, because this is a domain user. So you can, if you want to, if you're operating in a multi-domain environment, you can prefix that with the domain name and a backslash. All right, and then say OK. And voila, you are now up and running and you have logged in into your SAP Business One Cloud Control Center. But you'll see all of these indicators are zeros. That's because we have not yet done any of the work around registering all the different components. Now, there are lots of different components that you're going to have in your Cloud Control Center. And we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. Your service units. The service unit is the top level unit of infrastructure. And you will usually end up with multiple service units. And a service unit consists of one or more license servers. It can consist of one or more database servers, one or more presentation servers, and so on and so forth. And then sitting underneath the service unit, you have a customer. Okay, so you allocate a customer to a service unit. So the customer is the organization that is utilizing your service. And then underneath the customer, you actually have tenants. And a tenant, the best way to think about a tenant is an SAP Business One database. So if a customer has multiple SAP Business One databases, then they're going to have multiple tenants. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. Now, the other thing that the Cloud Control Center allows you to do, it allows you to manage the process of doing 30-day trials. So if you want to provide a 30-day trial environment for customers to use SAP Business One, Cloud Control Center helps you manage that. Plus, if you are in the business of running an industrial strength data center where you want to give resellers the ability to have their own separate Cloud Control Center environment and their own separate set of infrastructure, like their own separate service unit, their own separate, which is made up of their own separate databases and so on and so forth, then you can certainly do that. And that's what that whole reseller management is. And again, there is a functionality in the web front end that you can deploy, and we'll get to that, that allows you to automate that process of people coming in and placing those requests. All right, but for now, we're not going to do any of those things, because what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to install the SLD agent on each one of our components that is in our landscape. So I'm going to start off with installing the SLD agent on my HANA server. All right, so I already have my HANA server running across here. And so this is my HANA server. It's running SUSE Linux Enterprise version 11 and Service Pack 4, which is the supported environment. And so if I I'm not much for using the command line. I like to use my file browser. What I've done is I've already gone ahead and I have put all of my installation files on my root, and I've put them in a folder here called HANA. So you can see I've put all of my installation components, the HANA database, the studios, the AFL, all of my components are all sitting here ready for me to access. So I'm going to go into where I've extracted out the B1 cloud. Now you'll notice this directory structure is exactly the same, right? But I don't want to run this SLD underscore x64.exe. I want to go into the Linux folder, because remember, I'm installing this on HANA, which is running on Linux, and so I'm just going to double click and run the installer. Now, if you decided that you were going to put the SLD agent, the SLD server on your HANA box, you would run exactly the same piece of software. All right, you would run this installer. And then when it runs, it gives you two options. It gives you the option to install the SLD agent or to install the SLD server. So when we run it from now on all of our machines, we're only going to choose the SLD agent, as you'll see here. So I'll say next. It's going to ask me, where do you want everything to install? I usually accept the defaults. I'm a default kind of guy. And then you'll see you've got the system landscape directory OD, which is on demand. I don't want to install that because I've already got that. That's what we just installed. I now want to install the SLD agent. So then I'll say next. And it wants to know what is the name of this machine. So again, remember, this is where it's decision time, and actually you've probably made that decision already about whether or not you're using IP addresses or names when you installed HANA. I'm using names, so this machine is actually called hana-a.smbsolutions.com.au. all right, and then I'll say next. And the SLD URL, now this is important, okay? This is the same URL that you are using when you log on to the Cloud Control Center. All right, so unlike traditional SAP Business One, it's a little bit different. Although with 9.3, these things are starting to come together, and we'll talk about that in some other videos. But in this case, it's ccc.smbsolutions.com.au. Now here's the advantage. When I set that up, I used port 443, so I don't have to put port numbers after it or anything like that, because as soon as it sees the HTTPS, it knows it's going to try port 443 already. My site user ID is going to be smbsolutions/administrator. In your case, if you're using it, and I'm going to stop saying this in a minute, if you're using B1C admin, then that's what you'll put in there. And then I'm going to put in my password for that user, and then I'll say next. So we'll put in the /SLD/SLD0100.svc, and our username and password. Remember, these are the same usernames and passwords that you used when you configured your account for the Cloud Control Center. So I'll say next. And it's tested that, it's found it, it's been able to log on, so that's all good. I can save these settings in a property file for future use in case I ever have to deinstall and I want to reinstall it. So best practice is to do that. So I can say SLD agent underscore settings. All right. And it's going to save this wherever I put it. So I might put it in my folder for my documents, because again, remember, in this particular instance, I am logged in as root on my Linux box. All right, so that's the folder where I'm going to keep this. So then I'll say save, that's done, and now I'll say start. Now what it's doing is it's now installing the SLD agent, and that's a fairly quick process. Doesn't take a lot of time, and then it's going to write back to the Cloud Control Center. So what's going to happen when we go back to our Control Center and take a look? I'm actually now going to see that that SLD agent is available for me to see inside the system. So that's now done. I say next. It's telling me it's been installed successfully. I say next, and that's it. I now say finish. So that's how you install the SLD agent on one of your Linux boxes. All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. So let's now just go back. Here is my Cloud Control Center. So now if I am looking at my SLD agents, you'll now see there it is. It's registered one SLD agent on my machine, HANA-A. All right, and this is a task executor. So the system of the Cloud Control Center will be able to send instructions to your HANA server, like create your SBO common, for example, or create a new tenant database. Right, so that's important to understand. That's what the SLD agent does, is it performs those tasks. All right, so now if I go to database instances, you'll actually see that I don't have any database instances. But what I can now do, that I've installed that SLD agent on my HANA server, I'm going to register my HANA server. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say register. So I've gone to database instances, I've clicked register. The server type is, funnily enough, SAP HANA. And the name is required, so for me it's hana-a.smbsolutions.com.au. Now remember, it's Linux, right? And Linux is case sensitive. And then you need to put your port number, 30015. Now, for reasons that I won't go into, the port number that I'm going to use is going to be different. Why? Because I'm not using instance 00 for HANA, I'm using instance 01. All right, so I have to change. That's what these two numbers here represent, the instance number of your HANA box. So I actually have to change mine to 30115 in order for the HANA drivers to connect. So it's very, very important that you do that. All right, and then you're going to have a username that you're going to use to do that connection. Now I'm going to use system. Important point to note, SAP recommend that you do not use the system user for anything, that you create an additional user that you use for these kinds of tasks. And if you look at the B1 version for HANA guide, administrator's guide, you'll see it gives you a breakdown of all the necessary permissions that those users need to have. But I'm a lazy so-and-so, so I am going to use system, and this is just a demo environment anyway, so it doesn't matter. And then what is my system password? And you should hopefully be able to remember that from when you installed your HANA server. I'm going to connect using SSL, and if I want to do that, I then need to use my SSL key store string. All right, so if I'm going to use SSL, I need that key store string, but I'm not going to connect using SSL. Why? Because all of the traffic here is inside my network, so I don't see the need to go through that process of encrypting all of that traffic, because it's highly unlikely anyone's going to put a traffic sniffer, a packet sniffer on my network and start sniffing packets and then want to start trying to decrypt them to find usernames. All right. So you put in your database name. You can give it a name. You can say this is my primary HANA DB server. Call it whatever you like as long as it makes sense to you. And then you click on here and say test connection. I get a tick telling me that that connection was successful, and then I say register, and now my database instance is now registered. All right, so what have I done? I've installed the SLD agent on my HANA server, and I've also now registered my HANA server. There's one other component that you want to install on your HANA server, and that is the backup service. What we're going to do is we're just going to go back here into our HANA server, and I'm going to go back here to where all of my install files are. And if I go into my 9.2 patch level 8, because that's what I'm installing, I go here into my Linux packages and I go into my server components. I'm going to run my installer. Now, I want to explain something very, very important. This is something that Cornet explained to me, and it's kind of good advice. When you're installing and you're using the Cloud Control Center, you do not need to install the B1 Server Tools. The B1 Server Tools installs the SBO Common and all those other things. You don't need that. The Cloud Control Center is going to do that, and you'll see that as we progress. So if this is your first time looking at this, take a leap of faith and just trust me on this. What you also don't want to do is on your HANA server, you don't want to install any other components other than the backup service. Particularly, you don't want to install things like the service layer and so on. You want to install those on separate Linux boxes. Why? Because if something goes wrong with your service layer and you, for whatever reason, you need to reboot the server, well, this is your HANA server, right? So if you reboot the HANA server, everyone's going to lose access. Unless you're operating, of course, in a high availability environment. So the reason why we do this is so that all those other components that occasionally you have to restart the services and reboot the servers, they're on separate machines. So your HANA server will continue running without any problems. All right. Also, remember, as I said when we started, we want to keep our HANA server dedicated to the basic processes of running the HANA database, none of the other processes. All right, so that's why we're going to have a couple of other Linux boxes. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, well, why do we need a couple of other ones? Well, on one of those Linux boxes, we're going to install the license server, and on the other one, we're going to install the remaining components, the service layer, the job server, the analytics services, and so on and so forth. But remember, very, very important, you don't need to install the Business One server tools. You don't need to install the landscape directory. In a cloud environment, the Cloud Control Center does all that. So let's go ahead and you'll see what I mean. So I go in here and I say next. Where do I want everything installed? In this case, I'm going to say to user SAP Business One, again accepting the defaults. And so, what do I want here? Well, I don't want any of these components, okay, because I'm not installing any of those. I don't want the job service. I don't want the mobile service. I don't want the app framework. I do want the backup service. I don't need the SAP Business One server. So again, you can just collapse all of these. I don't want the analytical features, so you can collapse all of those as well. And I don't need the service layer components, so you can collapse all of those. So right now, on my HANA server, as well as HANA, the only two components I'm installing are the backup service and, remember, our SLD agent. So then I'll say next. Same scenario. It's asking me, is this machine an IP address or a host name? And again, remember, this is our HANA server, so it's a host name. Don't rush through these things. I made the mistake of, thinking I was smarter than I was, and occasionally I would rush through some of these things and end up typing in the wrong names. You're better off to go slowly and get it right the first time rather than try and backtrack and figure out what you did incorrectly. So that's our host name. That's our port number that we're going to use by the services that are being installed, so we'll leave that as the default. Again, same scenario, it's going to ask me for my certificate for HTTPS encryption. So again, I'm going to browse out, and we'll just go up here into the same location where I've put all my files, and that's where I've actually put that same certificate file that I used before. On my Cloud Control Center environment, I'm just using exactly the same file, and that's why wildcard certificates are great, because I can use this on any machine that is part of the smbsolutions.com.au domain. Yes, it's a little bit more expensive, but you only need to create it once, renew it once, and then you use it the whole way through on all of your machines in your environment, all of your services, whether it's remote desktop services, whether it's SQL services, whether it's Internet Information Server, or any of the SAP Business One components. All right, and so my certificate password, type that in, and then I'll say next. All right, so now remember, this is our landscape server. So this is HTTP. Actually, in this particular scenario, we can just put ccc.smbsolutions.com.au. It's on port 443. Now remember, what is our site user ID? It's SMB Solutions /administrator. And I know I said I wasn't going to say it again, but for you, this might be your B1C admin. All right. And then your password for that user. Now, if ever you get these things wrong, right, if you put in the information and it can't validate, it's going to bounce back and tell you, hey, we can't validate that information. Now, it's asking you for a couple of options. Where do you want to put your backup folders? Where do you want to put your log files? What's your working folder? Do you want to set a maximum backup folder size? All right, so that you don't fill your hard disk by accident. You can set that. And also, do you want to compress your company's schema imports when you are doing your your exports? When you're doing your backups in HANA, they're basically called schema exports. Do you want those to be compressed? I'd leave them uncompressed. Because I'll move them off site if I need to keep them. And then it's going to ask you, all right, you need to add or delete your SAP HANA databases for backup. And then I'll go in here and I'll say add. And now it's going to ask you for your HANA credentials. So hana-a.smbsolutions.com.au. Remember, my port number is 30115. For you, it's probably going to be 30015. My user is system, and my password for system. And then it also wants the operating system credentials. So when it's going to access the local file storage, that's what it's asking you for here. So I'm going to use root and my root password. All right, and then I'll say OK. So now it's able to go ahead and is able to log on, and it can see that database, so we're all good. And the service credentials have been provided, and it knows that the database storage is going to be, or the backup storage is going to be local. So then I'll say next. And we're all good to go. Again, I can save my settings if I want. Go into my documents. All right, there's my SLD agent settings. So this is my backup _service settings for the sake of the exercise, and then save. So if you ever get in a situation where you've got to do a disaster recovery, hopefully you've actually got the ability to do recovery back to from bare metal. Okay, but if you haven't, worst case scenario, store these files off site. That way, as you're going through this installation and reinstalling everything, you've got the maximum chance of getting it back exactly the same way that it was configured in the first place. And so we'll say start. And so now it's installing those server components. All right. Now this process will take a little bit longer than some of the other processes. So again, the secret here, be patient. Okay, wait for it to complete. It will get there. And now that it's gone through successfully, you'll get this view, and it'll tell you these are all the issues that it's discovered, or these are the things it wants you to double check. Okay, and you can see you've passed all of these options, and then it's just asking you to confirm that you've understood the information in the SAP notes. Now, some of these things are very, very important. All right, and these are important just with your general HANA environment anyway. They aren't specific to HANA in a cloud control center environment. So you do want to make sure that that you are aware of all these and that you have validated them. And then you'll say next, and that's now done. Okay, so your installation of the backup service is now complete. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to install the license service on another one of our Linux servers. So let's go and do that. Okay, so now we're into our second of our Linux boxes. Now I've called this one, funnily enough, Linux A.smbsolutions.com.au. And all I'm going to put on this one is I'm just going to put the SLD agent and I'm going to put the SAP Business One license server. So let's go ahead and we'll do that. So I'll go in here. Once again, I'm going to use my file browser because I'm lazy and I don't like using command prompts. And I've got my installers here in a folder called Installers SAP. And I'm going to open up my cloud, and here it is in our Linux folder again. And I'm going to run the install program to install the SLD agent. So you'll get used to the process after a while because, you know, as you're bringing on your new machines into your infrastructure, this part is quite repetitive. Now, one of the suggestions that SAP have is that you actually build an Active Directory package and use group policies to push the SLD agent out automatically to all of the servers that are in a particular group in your Active Directory structure. And that's not a bad idea as well, because then that happens. Obviously, you can't do that with your Linux boxes, but certainly with the Windows boxes, that's a good choice, particularly when you're like I am, where I have 5 different remote desktop servers in my environment. Okay, so trying to keep all of those maintained can be a bit of a challenge. So in this case, again, I'm removing the system landscape directory and I'm just installing the SLD agent. Again, I'm putting in, remember now this is the host name of the machine that you are on. So again, lowercase linux-a.smbsolutions.com.au, and then I am putting in my SLD URL, and once again you'll remember this is ccc.smbsolutions.com.au, and my site user ID, SMB Solutions /administrator, and my password, and then we say next. Okay, now again, remember when you're putting these details in here, it's always a good idea, /SLD/SLD .100.svc, and we'll say next. It's making that connection successful. So again, we're going to go in here, we're going to save our settings, and I'm going to put it in my documents folder. And of course, this is a different machine, remember, so I may potentially want to just go and gather all these up into a single folder on my network once I've finished my deployment. But this is going to be my license underscore server, and I'll actually prefix that with a Linux underscore license server. And we'll save that, and now we'll say start, and the SLD agent will go ahead and install. Again, this is nice and quick. And so then the next step is we go into our SAP Business One Linux packages. We're going to run our server install again, but same as we did before with the backup service, on this machine, all we're going to install is the license server. Okay. And part of the advantage of what we're doing here, when you put in that SLD directory name, it's automatically registering that particular component into the SLD. So we'll say next. That's been installed successfully. We'll say next and finish. And now we'll go back into my installers. There's my 9.2 PL8. Oh, and of course, don't forget that it's always a good idea to make sure that you have gone through and installed the necessary HANA drivers as well. All right, so you know your 64-bit and your 32-bit HANA drivers, depending on what you're working with. So again, I'll go into my Linux packages, into my server components, run my install. And some people say repetition is the mother of understanding. I actually think that's kind of right. And also, when you make mistakes, it can be frustrating, but sometimes you learn a lot from the mistakes and actually backtracking to see what you did, what that mistake caused. And I must admit that I've learned the most from my work from trying to fix up mistakes that I have made as I've been working through different processes. I'm not saying you should try to make mistakes, but don't get overly stressed about them, because they are a good learning opportunity. So again, we're going to just accept the defaults here. And our host name, again, linux-a.smb-solutions.com.au. And next. Okay. Now it's just telling me here I've actually got a problem, because what the system's trying to do is it is assuming that I am going to want to install the B1 backup service. And the challenge that I've got here is that the NFS kernel server is not installed on this machine. So we're going to have to go back and install that, which I will do right now. Now, just in case you're wondering and you run into the same issue, how do I install that? Well, I just simply come back in here, I load YAST, and then I come in and I'm going to configure my NFS server. It's telling me that this needs this particular package, which is the one that's missing. So I'll go in here and say install, let that install run. Won't take long. It's downloading the package because I've configured my Linux repositories correctly. All of my Linux boxes are registered and licensed and covered with SUSE support. So again, we're in good shape there. All of that happens for you automatically when you're configuring your Linux boxes. All right, and that should be enough for the system to work effectively. So now I'm going to just close down YAST. We'll go back in and we'll go through that process again. Go and run my install. We're running our installation and upgrade. Accepting that directory. Same as we did before. And now I don't get that message about the missing component. So right now what I'm going to do though is I'm going to unselect all my server tools. I'm going to unselect my app framework, the backup service, my Business One server tools, because I don't need those. And that's quite a big stack there, so I'm just going to collapse that so that brings the rest in for me. Get rid of my analytical features, and I'm also going to get rid of my service layer components. And then I'm just going to come back here and only tick the license manager. So as I scan through my list of actions, I've only got one action, and that is to install the license manager. So I'll say next. Again, we have our machine name. And we'll say next. That's going to be the port that's used for our license server, so that's the standard port, so you want to remember that. We're selecting our certificate again, and once again I've got that certificate. I've moved that into my installer location as well. So when I go into my installer's SAP, I've actually put my certificate file in there as well. Putting in our password for that. And now our landscape server, as we have done before. And it's port 443. And then we'll say next. And now it's asking me with my license server, is this a standalone node or am I moving this into a high availability mode where I've got two license servers and they're working in an active scenario. So right now I'm just going to have I'm just going to have this standalone node. All those settings are fine. I'll save those settings again. You're getting probably sick of me saying these things, but it doesn't matter. I've already actually selected my Linux license server, so that file there actually, I need to rename that file. And this is it's just my SLD agent. And this one is my Linux license server. So I'll accept that. And let's just change this to Linux _ license _ server. Save it, and away we go. And once again, this is going to be one of those processes that's going to take a little bit of time. So I'm just going to pause the recording while this runs through, and then we'll come back at the end once that's completed, and we'll check, as we have done with all of our other machines, that that it has installed correctly. Now, just as an FYI, you might be wondering, hang on, why is this a smaller screen? Or maybe you haven't picked that up. But the reason why this is a smaller screen is that this Linux box, I'm actually running in a virtualized environment. I'm not running it on VMware, on vSphere. This Linux box, I'm actually running on Hyper-V. Now, that's not supported in a production environment, but in a testing and demo environment, absolutely you can go ahead and use that because it does work. But don't go calling for support because it's not a supported environment. Certainly not by SAP. SUSE Linux on Hyper-V is actually a supported combination by both SUSE and by Microsoft, but certainly not by SAP. They much prefer that you deploy on top of VMware. So anyway, the reason why this is a smaller window is it just doesn't have some of those configuration options that I've got with VMware, with vSphere, to make it a full 1920 by 1080 size screen. So I've just let it sit at the maximum size there. All right, so that's now completed and it's all worked effectively. I've got my successful installation and that's great. And then I'll say finish. So that's now, that machine is taken care of. All right, so that's our Linux A. And then the next one we're going to do is our Linux B. And on the Linux B box, we're going to install the rest of our components. But before we do that, let's just go back into our Cloud Control Center. It's been a while since we used it, so it's logged off. And if I now go back in here and look in the system, you'll see there it is. There's my Linux A .smbsolutions.com.au. But of course, what can you see here? You're getting a little warning message telling you that there's no license files available yet on this server. And that's correct, because we haven't, even though we've got our hardware key, we have to go ahead and we have to request our license files. All right, now, and remember, with the Cloud Control Center, you can use your own license files. Clients can bring their own license files, so you've got a lot of flexibility in that respect. But let's now dive back, and we're going to go into our Hyper-V. And we're back here in our Hyper-V, and I'm going to launch my Linux B box. And it's the same scenario here. And there it is, there's my Linux B. Just tidy up the background there for the recording. And I'm going to log in as the root user. Got a little bit too excited there. And put in my password. Alright, and what do you think we have to do first? And if you said you need to go and install the SLD agent, you're absolutely correct. So I'm not going to make you sit through that again. I'm just going to go ahead and install the SLD agent, and we'll come back once that's actually finished. So our SLD agent's now installed, and we'll go back into our packages for Linux, into our server components, and we'll run our installer. And again, we're just accepting those defaults. And this time, what I'm going to do is I am unselecting the system landscape directory, and I'm unselecting the license manager. But we're going to have the rest of our services. We're not going to have the backup service there, but we're going to have our app framework, our job service, our mobile service. We don't want the SAP Business One server on any of our machines here. So we'll just remove that. We do want our analytical features, so we'll have all of those selected, and we do want our service layer. All right. And then we'll say next. Now, of course, the scenario here is you can split your environment into as many different servers as the load dictates. All right. But once you've got the concept, you know, it's a much easier process. And a lot of people, as I did until Cornet pointed out to me, a lot of people do try and put some of these services on the same machine. So the main thing we're trying to get to here is make sure that you do not put any of these other services on your HANA box, because again, remember, in a cloud environment, it's all about high availability. It's all about making sure that you can keep your environment running as smoothly as possible with as little downtime as possible. So this machine is linux-b.smbsolutions.com.au. Make sure I got that right. Yes, I did. Again, port 40,000. We're going to specify our certificate store. And I'm going to get that here from our installers. There it is. Our parameters are all the same here as we've done it already a number of times. All right, now, important, this is obviously the first time we've been prompted for this information. So, because remember, these are now additional components that are going to be talking directly to the HANA server. So what it wants to know right now is what is the name of your HANA server. So for me, again, mine is HANA-A, and my port is 30115. Again, remember, because I'm using instance 01, I'm not using instance 00 as you probably would be. Again, SAP recommend that you create a different user to be used here. And there's just a warning here that's saying, hey, there's no service unit that's registered in the selected system landscape directory. So it's just saying we're going to have to combine these services with the service unit manually. And that's okay, because that's exactly what I expect to have happen. And we do want an automatic restart to occur. So I'm going to set this with my credentials so it can trigger that process. And we'll say next. Now this is where we're installing the service layer load balancers. So the load balancer is basically setting up a number of different instances for the service layer, so that will handle all the different calls that you might have coming in from your extensions, or the different applications, the different reporting tools that you've got that are going to go ahead and access the service layer. So I accept the defaults here, but of course once you get more familiar with the service layer and you start seeing the loads that are in your environment, you'll potentially need to go in and adjust this and potentially add additional machines for your service layer. So you can scale horizontally by adding more machines, or you can scale vertically by adding more CPU power, for example, in a virtualized environment, and adding additional load balance members. I'm just going to accept the defaults here. That's all great. I'll save my settings. And these are my other underscore Linux underscore services. I'll say save, and now I'll start the install. And this install actually takes quite a long time because there's a lot of different components for it to install. So again, I'm going to pause the recording when it's finished. And of course, now you're going to see that it's popping up our documentation for the SAP Business One service layer. So you may want to save that URL as a bookmark, and the system will continue on. Okay, and so that's all worked correctly. And so we'll now say next. We've got our successful flags against all of those options. Again, there's that warning which we got up front. And we just are going to acknowledge that we've seen all of these recommendations, and we say finish. And of course now, if I go back in to my SLD, one of the things that you will see, if I go in here, for example, to Analytics Services, there it is, my Analytics Services is there, my app frameworks are there, my service layers are there, my mobile services are there, so that's all set up perfectly. So the next step is for me to go in and start configuring some of my other components. So that's it for part one of this session. If you've gotten through all of this, you've done really well. I'll look forward to seeing you in part two.